Okay, so welcome to this second lecture. Today we will have a look in the first hour to Brownian simulations, how to simulate Brownian particles, and in the second hour we will see agent-based models. The lecture will be a bit dense, but you can watch it at your leisure because it will be recorded, so I will try to pack the information. Okay, so let's start. Brownian motion. So I guess all of you know what Brownian motion is. So you know Brownian motion is the motion of microscopic particles, for example in a liquid, due to the fact that there are molecules in the liquid bombarding these particles and pushing them around. So this is a fundamental concept both in physics and in mathematics. Just to give an idea of the importance of Brownian motion, many people think of Einstein to 1905. There are these famous papers that he published. And one was the photoelectric, well, one relativity, which is what people know Einstein for. The other is the photoelectric effect, for which he got the Nobel Prize. But many people in statistical physics will argue that the most important paper was actually the one explaining Brownian motion. And in fact, Perrin, a few years later, got the Nobel Prize for using Brownian motion to measure the size of molecules. And this is really what convince the scientific community of the actual existence of atoms. So it's really an important concept. So here I just show you one of the most boring boogies you can imagine. This is just a Brownian particle. It just, you see, this is just floating around. This motion happens at thermal equilibrium, so there is no energy injected into the system. The particle will stay there moving around forever. The question is, how do we model this? And to do that, I want to make a step back to Newton's law and see how we go from Newton's law. Well, you know, all of you know Newton's law. So, can you recognize what is this? I guess all of you recognize that this is F equal ma, just written in a more complex form. This is F equal ma, so the Newton's law for a single particle. And we can rewrite this as a difference equation. So you see it here. I guess all of you know perfectly how to do this, so I will not go into the details. This is the Euler scheme, which is the simplest one. Of course, you have much better ones, but this is really all we need for what we want to do, which is to find how to model Brownian motion. If we go to multiple particles, essentially we can have the equivalent of Newton's law, but written with vectors, so that we can have any number of particles. And I leave you as a very simple exercise to figure out what is the corresponding difference equation. Okay, so this is Newton's law. And just to clarify, what can I do with this Newton law? I can do what is called molecular dynamics. Here you see an example. So here you see we have a large particle in a sea of small particles, these small dots. And what we will do here is to simulate the motion of this particle. Let me start. And obviously, this simulation is perfectly deterministic because we are just simulating the motion of the particle as a function of time with a set of finite differences equation which are completely deterministic. So if I run 10 times the simulation, I will get exactly the same results as long as initial conditions are the same. There is no randomness. But what I would like you to notice is this side of the video. Here you see the trajectory of this particle, of the large red particle. And you see that this is it's completely random. So you don't really see the deterministic aspect of the simulation. Why? Because the particle is being pushed by lots of particles which overall produce a random effect. So here you see that how we go from Newton's law to Brownian motion. So how we go from a fully deterministic system to a system that looks very stochastic. And okay, now the question is, how do we model this? Of course, we could make molecular dynamics all the time, but it's very computationally expensive and complex, so we don't want to do that. So about 100 years ago, Langevin came up with this equation. Again, this is just Newton's law because you have acceleration, mass, friction force, and the interesting, well, up to here it's just Newton's law, F equal ma, for a particle in a liquid where you have friction from the fluid molecules. And Langevin added another term, which is a random force. So he just said, okay, let's take this equation and let's add a random force. And this can be a good model for a Brownian particle in a liquid. Why in a liquid? Because there is the friction force, this part. And this works very nicely. And we can, well, if we want to simulate this, we need to transform this into a stochastic difference, finite difference equation. And the rules are for the deterministic part, so for this part and this part, the rules are the same as for a normal differential equation. So you substitute x with xi, the value of x at time I, dx over dt with xi minus 1 over delta t, which is the time step, and so on for higher derivatives. You can substitute these terms very, very smoothly. The question is, what do we do with a random force? This is much more complex when we want to simulate it. I'm not going to go into the details of the mathematical derivation, which you can see. You can find some of these details in the readings I gave for this class, but I want to give you a feeling for how it practically works. So let's start with a very simple equation, the simplest equation you can imagine, which is this one, where we take dx of t over dt, so the first derivative of the position equal to a white noise. And just to clarify, this is a white noise of the simplest kind, so a white noise with no correlation in time and of power 1, just to keep everything simple. The corresponding stochastic differential equation is this one. So you see that this term comes from this, xi minus 1 over delta t, and then we move xi minus 1 to the other side, and we multiply everything by delta t. The curious and only difficult part here is this. So in front of the stochastic term, you have to put a square root of delta t. The explanation is in the, I don't want to go into the mathematical explanation, there is an explanation, but it's complicated, it will take me 1 hour. But operatively, this is what you should do, sorry. And this wi is nothing else than a random number, which has average 0 and variance 1. Again, all of this is written in the papers I suggested you to read. So let's now move one step further. Instead of a noise of intensity 1, we can imagine to have a noise with a certain strength, which is different from 1, so that a noise xi of t, which is equal to square root of 2d times wt. Reason why I use 2d is because this refers to the physical concept of diffusion, and the 2 prefactor was put by Einstein, and people keep on using it. How does it work? Well, I guess all of you can figure out how the corresponding difference equation, stochastic difference, this should be difference, not differential, sorry. Difference equation should look like this. And, well, we just multiply the noise term by square root of 2d, this term. If we go to something more difficult, now we have a second, well, now we go back to the Langevin equation. And here we have temperature and friction, because this is 2. Kb, it's a constant, the Boltzmann constant. T is the absolute temperature, gamma is the friction. And the reason why I write the diffusion like this and not like this is because, well, physically, these are the values that are correct. And I guess all of you by now will be able to rewrite this as a difference equation, which again, I will leave as a very simple exercise. Okay, now let's go one step further. This is the same Brownian particle that we saw before. You see, just floating around, doing nothing very interesting. We can transform this into an active Brownian particle if we give it self-propulsion. This is the very same particle. I'm not going to explain how it works, but you see that for some reason, when we shine light of the appropriate wavelength, this particle starts propelling itself. So you see that now it's not Brownian anymore, it's an active particle. So it follows a path which is, well, it goes straight for a while, then rotates slowly. The rotation is due to rotational Brownian diffusion, but the same particle can become an active particle once we add propulsion. Okay, so this is an experiment. But the relevant question for this course is, how do we model this? And, well, it's very simple. We take a Brownian particle and we add it self-propulsion. So basically we make this particle move along a certain direction with a speed v and at an angle phi, which might vary over time. The corresponding differential equations are these ones. So you see, now we have the angle which diffuses randomly. This means that the particle rotates randomly due to rotational Brownian diffusion. Then we have the position x and y, which have the Brownian motion, so they move randomly, but also they have a component which is directed. This v speed multiplied by the cosine and sine of the angle. So the particle is moving with a certain direction, which varies slowly over time. What we saw, exactly what we saw before. Now, just to give you a feeling for how these trajectories will look like. As we increase the speed of the particle, so here you see, for each one of these we have 4 trajectories color-coded. They are all the same amount of time, and for a particle with the same rotational and translational intrinsic diffusion, but with different speed. As the speed goes up, obviously the particle explores a larger area, simply because it's moving more. We can go one step further and make also what is called chiral active Brownian motion. The difference here, I mean, you can see the difference now. Now the angle of the particle is not just rotating randomly, but has a bias, likes to move in one direction preferentially. And this is reflected in the equation. I guess all of you saw the difference with the previous equation. And just to highlight it, the difference is here. So there is this bias factor in the angle, which is omega, can be positive or negative, and makes the particle rotate preferentially in one direction. How do the trajectories look like? Well, here we can see some trajectories. And yeah, what you see here is trajectories for, well, you see that there are 2 color-coded trajectories. I guess all of you can, well, I've already guessed the difference between these 2 trajectories. Obviously, one has positive omega and the other has negative omega. And what is interesting here is that, well, so this is clear. So you have 2 chiralities. And the other thing that might be interesting, you can compare the trajectory for the 3 cases. Maybe you can guess the difference. Well, the difference is the amount of rotational diffusion of this term. As rotational diffusion becomes stronger, even though the chiral component is always the same, well, the rotational diffusion disrupts the chirality of the motion, making it look less clear. So it doesn't move in almost perfect circles, but it starts moving in trajectory that look much more stochastic, like this one, and even more in this case. Again, all of this information is in the tail, in the reading materials. Okay, so what can we do with the active Brownian particle? Well, active Brownian particles are a very good tool to understand how, in a very simplified model, how agents can interact with a complex or crowded environment. And what I will do in the rest of the next 20 minutes is to give an overview of some examples which might also motivate or inspire possible projects you might do during the course. So let's start with the first one, particle sorting. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to sort particles. Why people want to sort particles? Well, it's very, very useful for many things, you can imagine. Think of food industry, cosmetic industry, environmental monitoring. We really want to know what particles are in different solutions, for example. Here, I want to tell you about one way of doing sorting, which is essentially based on the active particle swimming style. So here I'm using the word Microswimmers, but you can read it as well as active particles. It's the same. Microswimmers is used in the scientific literature when we refer to particles that are actually swimming in a solution, so physical examples. So in this case, I want to sort microswimmers based on the swimming style. So what we can do is to build, for example, an environment where there are lots of pillars. So these elliptical shapes are pillars in a microfluidic chamber, and imagine that this is vertical. Now imagine that I release a Brownian particle, a particle that doesn't have any active Brownian motion. What will happen? Well, the particle will just go against one pillar and sit there, probably. If I have an active particle instead, the particle will be able to move straight for a while when its direction is correct. And when it takes exactly the 60-degree direction, the particle will be able to really run through this pseudo channel, if you wish. Or it can even go in the 90 degrees direction, defeating gravity a bit. Well, so let's see how it looks like. So there is this force, so a Brownian particle just falls down. So here you see an experimental example of this. You see that this Brownian particle is just slowly falling down. But then we can also imagine an active particle where you see that now the active particle instead likes to move in the diagonal directions. And if the particle is even more active, it likes to move instead even along these horizontal channels, along the horizontal direction. So you see what we have. We have a way to sort particles based on their swimming style. And this, without going too much into the details, here you see some examples of going from a particle that is purely Brownian, so no directed velocity, to a very strong particle that has a very high directed velocity. And you see that Brownian particles will just fall straight and active particles will move along the diagonal direction. So, and you see here a nice thing, this is an actual paper, and you see that it's very nice to have simulations of such a complex system, because then you can compare the simulations to the experiment and verify that you really understand the physical principle behind the motion of these particles. So, first example, sorting active particles based on the swimming style. What can you use it for? For example, to sort bacteria or sperm cells and so on. Okay, let's go to another example, which I like particularly. This is metastable clusters and channels. The reason why I like it particularly is because it's colorful and because this is actually a thesis project, master thesis project done by a student in the, well, in your program in complex adaptive systems a few years ago. So here the question is the following. Well, we want to understand how lots of active particles interact. So we construct an interaction formula between this particle. It looks complicated, but it's quite simple, well, relatively complicated, but you see that the formula is not that complex in reality. I will explain it. So the idea is the following. Imagine that you have a particle here and an active particle coming from this direction. If the particle comes straight against the particle, there is no torque acting on this particle. If the particle comes along this from the back, then the particle tends to get aligned towards the red particle, more aligned, less aligned. If it's exactly on the side of the red particle, it will go straight. If it's in front of the red particle, it will tend to get and to move away from the direction, well, align itself towards this direction away from the red particle, you see. And if it's exactly in front, just go straight. So let's build a bit of intuition about this. So imagine that you have these two particles with these directions. What will happen? Try to figure out, and I ran the movie. So you see, they will just go straight because they are both in this situation, so they go straight against each other. What happens is if instead these two particles start touching each other, but with the directions pointing away from each other? Well, then they are in this situation, both of them, so they will move away from each other. What happens if they are one after the other aligned like this? Well, then they are, one is in this situation, the other is in this situation, and you see what happens. They move.
Excuse me, sir, can I have a question about this?
Yes.
Is there any rule related with the attraction force and the repulsion force?
No, in this case, no. There is just, well, the only rule is that they cannot go inside each other. So if they touch, they cannot go farther.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
But you could introduce those rules if you wish. This case, you see what will happen. They move in this trajectory. This case, they move I would suggest that you try to figure out before I run the movie what will happen in this case. If it was a real class, I will actually ask you. But you see, they come together. In this case, again, they create a cluster. In this case, well, that's what happens. So you see, there is the basic point here is that an extremely simple rule produces very interesting behaviors. Let's see something more interesting. What happens when we put a lot of this particle in one environment? So here we have a lot of this particle. Each dot here represents a particle, and see what happens. Now they change color when clusters are formed. So here not much is happening. Sometimes two particles come together, form a small cluster, and it becomes red, but that's it. The reason is because there is a lot of rotational Brownian motion, so the particles are not very well aligned to each other. Well, they keep on changing the direction continuously. Let's see if we reduce the amount of noise in the system. Then it starts becoming more interesting, because you see that now the particles can form small clusters of two particles, or that can swim, or they form trimers that are pretty stable in this case because there is not too much rotational Brownian motion. And if you reduce even further the amount of noise, rotational noise, then you see that the cluster become even bigger. So we can create large clusters, up to 6, 7, 8 particles, which are metastable, which practically means that they last for a while. Why they don't last forever? Well, because there is rotational Brownian motion, and sooner or later the particles will leave the cluster. Also, some other particle can come from somewhere else, come to the cluster and destroy it, as you see happening in this video. Okay, this is interesting, but we can even go one step further. What happens if I add also passive particles in this simulation? Now you see what happens. Here we have both active particles, which are the red dots with the blue tail. The blue tail represents a kind of a shunt left by the particle. You will see that the blue tail over time decays. Anyway, first case, lots of rotational Brownian motion for the active particles. The passive particles are just passive. Passive here means that they do Brownian motion, but they move very little in reality because they're not really actively moving anywhere. But you see, with a lot of noise, well, the active particles stay in one place, push around the passive particles, create a hole for themselves, and settle there, more or less. As we reduce the amount of rotational diffusion for the active particles, you see that something interesting starts to happen. The active particles start to push away the passive particles and creating a small channel for themselves. So they can go from one well created by one particle to the well created by the next particle. If you reduce it even further, well, you see that now it starts getting beautiful, because you see that now the active particles really create some kind of channels, small proto-channels between the wells. And if you reduce the noise in the rotational alignment of the active particles even further, then it becomes really a network of channels that the active particles create and stabilize over time. I think this is a very beautiful result. Again, very nice that it was obtained by a student doing his master thesis. This was by Simon Nielsen 4 years ago. Very nice result. And you see that they also create these trails of particles, because now they like to use the channel because it's easier for them to go into the channel than to push away the passive particles. So the channels become stabilized by the activity of the active particles. Here, for example, it would be very interesting to find out if there is a threshold of the number of active particles necessary in order to create stable channels. An open question.
Can I ask a question on this?
Sure.
So the passive particles, do they are the active particles attracted, or do their direction in some way, or is it affected by the passive particles as well?
It's exactly the same formula as between active particles, what I illustrated before. In that case, the passive particle is obviously fixed.
So the passive particles are not aligning the active particles, they are only obstacles in this case?
They are aligning the active particles according to the rule that I showed before. But obviously they are not being realigned by the active, well, they could be, but they will only make them rotate. It will not change their motion because they don't have active motion. But the rule between all particles is the same, and it's the one I showed you 2 slides ago.
Okay.
But that's a very good point. And by the way, just to give you some historical background, we are trying to get this kind of result for many years before Simon managed to do that. The key point was exactly what you mentioned, to get also the passive particles to interact with the active particles according to the same rule. That's why we could get the channels. So that's really the fundamental thing that you need to put in this simulation to get this effect. So very good point. Okay, let's go to another example. And this is actually self-assembly of active colloidal molecules. We'll see what we mean by that. So far, I have shown you something where we have active particles which propel themselves. Here, I show you something slightly different. So here, you have a solution of two particles. By the way, this is an actual experiment, and this is the corresponding simulation. Again, you see the importance of simulation in understanding experiments. Anyway, so in this experiment, you see that there are two kinds of particles, the red one and the blue ones. Now, they are both passive. Both red and blue are passive. The difference is that red particles are absorbing light. So when we turn on the light, what happens is that the active particles become warm. The red particles become warm, and the blue particles remain cold. But they are still passive. I mean, the fact that they become warm means that they move a bit more. That's it, but still in place. What happens once in a while is that red particles come close to blue particles and they form dimers. And now you have a particle which is, well, cold on one side and warm on the other side. So there is a gradient of temperature around the particle. And now, one thing that you need to know in physics in general, if there is an asymmetry of any kind, typically things start moving. In this case, you have a gradient across the particles, the dimer, and therefore the dimer starts moving. And once it starts moving, moves around, but kind of looks for other, it doesn't look, but sometimes it meets other particles and creates larger clusters. And this is what we call active molecules. The nice thing is that these active molecules emerge from passive particles spontaneously. And of course, when we switch off the light, they break down. Now here you see the corresponding videos. So you see that as soon as we switch on the light, they start moving around, creating these dimers, and then they, well, when we switch off the light, they break apart. Again, there is a very good agreement between simulations and experiment, and the reason why it's so important to have such agreement is because it tells you that you understand the basic underlying principles in your experiment if you can simulate it. Because in the simulation, you have full control of the rules which the particles are obeying, which you don't know in an experiment, obviously. Okay, just to give you an idea how complex it's an old zoological garden, as we like to say, that comes out of these particles. So you have two kinds of passive particles, which are red and blue. It's obviously color-coded by us, but red means that they warm up when we shine light. Blue means that they don't care about whether we shine light or not. They stay at the same temperature. When they form dimers or something pointed, like arrowhead if you wish, then they become propellers, which propel along a line. These are really active particles. They are perfectly described by the active Brownian motion I told you about a few slides ago. Of course, if they form structures that are symmetric, they don't move, because again, when there is symmetry, things don't move in physics, at least in the direction in which there is a symmetry. They can become spinners when you have this chiral shape, or they can become chiral rotators, which practically are chiral active Brownian particles. So they perform this motion, which is, as you might remember from a few slides ago, a chiral active Brownian motion. Okay, and finally, I would like to give another example. This is purely simulated. And here it's about optimal search strategy. And the question we are trying to answer here is, how do we look for targets in the optimal way? It's a very important question, and I will explain you, but I will give you the model first. The model is active Brownian particle. You see, phi and the angle of the particle, and v the speed. It's really just an active. Well, there is one difference, but I will explain that in a moment. But it's essentially an active Brownian particle, and there are some targets. So imagine this as a 2D plane with many targets, and you want to send your particle around looking for the targets. Now, imagine that this particle is blind and doesn't have any way of sensing the environment. It simply captures the targets if it passes over them. But it has to find a random, a stochastic search strategy. And yeah, I don't want to go too much into the mathematics of this, but the basic point is that we can have different strategies parameterized by this parameter alpha. What does it mean, alpha? So let's start from alpha equal 2. Alpha equal 2 means active Brownian particle. Exactly the one I described at the a few slides ago. So that's the model. What's the difference when alpha becomes smaller and goes towards 1? Well, when we get to 1, this means that this is a Levy flight. We'll see what the Levy flight means. So let's start from alpha equal 2. You have an active Brownian particle, and means, well, an active Brownian particle, there is rotational diffusion, it's moving around, that's it. Nothing very exciting there. For alpha equal 1, what happens is the following, is that the particle moves in one direction for a very long time, and then at random times switches direction. The distribution of these random times follows the Levy distribution, and that's why these are called Levy flights. And what you will see is that, again, we can look at trajectories. So if alpha is equal to, well, you see several trajectories. Since these are active Brownian particles, they move around, but they move around very close to their initial position. But as alpha becomes smaller and smaller and eventually becomes 1, you see that there are once in a while these huge directed flights, the Levy flights. So you see that this space is explored in very different ways, going from alpha equal 2 to alpha equal 1. And obviously, this means that the number of targets you catch changes. You can only imagine, well, you can see that, right? In the case of Levy flights, alpha equal 1, the area explored by the particle is much larger, so the particle will catch more targets. So you see that alpha equal 1, you catch most targets. As you become more and more an active particle, you catch less targets. Okay, nothing surprising here, and it's really nothing surprising because this is the core of what people do in the physics of foraging. Foraging means studying how animals look for food or mates, and there is a huge literature in the last, I will say, 30 years studying these behaviors, and there are lots of animals that need to look for food, and there are lots of studies that try to understand how they look for food, and lots of animals seem to follow more or less a Levy strategy because that's optimal to find their targets. So this is something you can simulate, but it becomes much more interesting if you start, well, I mean, one thing that there is not here, or in the literature for the large part, is boundary structure. Usually a particle, an animal, doesn't live in an environment that is empty with only targets. There are lots of structures in the environment. And these structures alter enormously how the interaction, well, what is the best search strategy. So just to try to show you why, let's look at this simple example. Imagine here that you have a normal Brownian particle in a well. So there is this circular well and there are these Brownian particles moving around. Well, what they will do is to explore uniformly the whole well. So their probability distribution is perfectly uniform. Now, if you have an active particles instead, what will happen? Well, you can see what will happen. The active particle will go straight to the wall and spend a lot of time on the wall until it rotates away from it, but as soon as it rotates away from it, it will go to the other side of the wall. So the distribution of the active particles, as long as their activity is sufficiently high, will make them spend a lot of time at the walls. So you see that, I mean, you see that already that the optimal strategy will be different in the two cases. In this case, for example, to have a Levy strategy would be very bad because you will spend all the time at the wall and you will only catch targets that are at the wall, essentially missing everything that is inside the circle. And just to give you, I mean, this is actually something very well known. in the sense that there are many studies that check that, and this has been observed, for example, with bacteria in microfluidic wells. So the bacteria accumulate at the wall, has been shown also on well, bacteria and other microorganisms, but very interesting, has been shown also on ants. And this is an experiment that you can literally do. If you go outside and you find an ant, you take a petri dish, take an ant, put it inside the petri dish, and you will see what the ant will do. The ant will go straight to the wall and start walking around the wall. Once in a while, the ant will come out of the wall and go straight to the other side of the wall and start rotating again. So the ant will spend most of its time at the wall. And you can do it yourself. Of course, if you do that, at the end of the experiment, you have to take the ant and put it back in the environment to comply with ethical issues. Okay, so what is interesting here? Well, then it's very interesting to try to study what happens when we have a complex environment. In this case, we have a complex environment made essentially like a Swiss cheese. So we have circular wells and targets distributed uniformly within these circular wells. Then when we have a Brownian particle moving there, alpha equal 2, well, what happens is that the particle will really explore very well one of these circles, but will not move very far. As we move towards more and more Levy flight strategy, the particle manages to travel more. But you see, when it's really a Levy flight, what happens is that the particle gets stuck against a wall for a very long time. So you can imagine that there is an optimal compromise between exploring exhaustively a well and moving between wells. And in fact, the optimal strategy is neither a Brownian motion nor a Levy flight. It's something intermediate. This is a very exciting and surprising results we obtained a few years ago. Again, this is purely simulations and something that, yeah, hopefully can inspire some of you. Okay, so with this, I conclude this first part of the class. If you have any questions, please let me know. And I will look also at if there are questions in the chat.
Is there any
please.
Is there any explanation for this behavior that we observe and simulate?
Which behavior?
That it's something in reality, it's something between the walking between the and the walls and being in the middle.
Yes. Just a second. Yeah. The reason is the following, because in this way you explore more wells in the intermediate case.
Oh, okay.
Because the point is this, if you spend a lot of time in one well, you will eat all the targets, but then you keep on going around, there is nothing else to eat. If you move to the next well and you spend a lot of time at the wall, there is nothing to eat there. So
Yeah.
there is an optimal time you should spend in each well before you move to the next well. Maybe you don't catch everything, but you catch more targets. There is a very beautiful example of this. Think about going to the woods and collecting blueberries. I mean, you should not go to the first bush of blueberries and collect every single one. There is an optimal time in which you should stop and move to the next one. And this really depends on how the blueberry bushes are distributed.
Mm.
If you want to have the maximum number of blueberries.
Yeah,
Is there any
thanks.
other question? I see a lot of questions in the chat. Since I cannot read and speak at the same time, please just ask them to me if you want me to answer by voice. If not, I will answer during the break.
A follow-up question about the slide. I want to clarify that when alpha is equal to 2, does it mean this is a pure random, pure Brownian motion, right?
In this case, yes.
Okay. How about the alpha is equal to 1? Is what motion?
Alpha equal 1 is Levy walk, essentially.
Levy walk. Okay. Yeah.
And here, alpha equal 2 in reality, it's equivalent to a Brownian motion, but to be on the technical side, we simulate all of this as an active Brownian motion, in which we didn't put any noise in the position, so the translation diffusion is 0, but we change the statistics of the angle. So in reality, in the simulation, they are all active Brownian motion, where we change just the statistics of how we change the angle.
Okay, that means all these 5 figures below is changing the direction of the angle, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
But if you're interested in the paper we describe, which are references here, we describe this in very much detail. So.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Yes. So when we talk about using white noise to introduce randomness, in this case to the angle, is that equivalent to just drawing from a rectangular distribution, or how do we get white noise on a computer?
White noise, okay. So white noise doesn't matter the distribution you use to have white noise, as long as at each time step the noise is independent from the previous time step.
Okay.
So when we say white noise, we just mean that they are uncorrelated between time steps. The distribution doesn't matter. Now, which distribution should you use? It doesn't really matter too much, as long as the time step is small enough, and as long as the average of the random number is 0 and its variance is 1. Then the reason why it doesn't matter the distribution, specific distribution you use, is because of the central limit theorem and the fact that essentially all distribution will fall in the same universality class, as long as what I said before is respected.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, obviously you can take a break. I will keep on answering questions if there are, and you can listen or take a break as you wish. Okay, so if there are no questions, I will, I will answer the ones in the chat. But I'm here, so if you have more questions, just ask. Okay, so let's go into the second part of the class, which is going to be about agent-based models. And we'll see we actually make use of active particles. So what are examples of agent-based models? So there are plenty of examples. Again, here I will give a very quick overview, and maybe some of these examples can inspire you also in your projects. So here we have a very simple example. What is this? It's a fish looking for food. A very simple example of foraging. In this case, we have a single agent looking for targets, which are motile in themselves. Here, you have multiple agents. These are bacteria moving in a microfluidic system, and you see that they create some structures which are interesting themselves. Multiple agents interacting with each other. Here, you have another example where you have cells that are essentially closing a wound. And you see that over time they move and reorganize. And of course, with cell you can do a lot of things. So here you see a tissue that is growing, and you see how you can analyze it. For example, here you see that in the video is shown how you can track the cells, see their centers, construct the Voronoi tessellation, and from the Voronoi tessellation then study, for example, how cells move and multiply. It's a very interesting system. Curiosity about this. Very similar models to tissues growing have been used to study how crowds congregate, for example, in a concert. Because, in a concert, one of the concerts, obviously not classical music where you are sitting in your booth, but like a rock concert where everyone is in the stadium and close to each other. People are essentially behaving like deformable particles, And if you want to move around, you have to do something more or less like this. And this is very important to understand, for example, what is the maximum number of people you should put in a concert, how you should design the escape routes to prevent people from crashing each other, and so on. Okay, here another example, scaling up. You can think about fishes and how they react to the presence of a predator, in this case a shark. And of course, you can go to birds that form this kind of structure. Again, what is interesting here is that each bird is thinking on its own, maybe looking around, but they don't really have any knowledge about an overall plan, about how things should go. So, very interesting to study this kind of systems. Human crowds, very interesting human crowds. And of course, you can do a lot of things with human crowds, because you can, for example, track human crowds, and you can even study how they organize themselves spontaneously, for example, in lanes. This is actually a study that was done to study if you tell people to move opposite each other, they will spontaneously organize themselves into lanes, such as the one you can see here. You can, of course, then do something similar with animals. This is an example that should remind you of what I was telling you before, the fact that if you put some insects into a well, they will start moving along the walls. In this case, there are lots of insects, so they cannot all go to the walls and move along the walls, so they create this kind of pattern. But again, what is very interesting to see here is that they self-organize to move in one direction. They don't move in opposite direction. Why? Probably because it's easier to go all in one direction than to bump against other insects each time you move. Some more example. You can do the same with human crowds. This is a very nice study in which basically they didn't just track the position of people, but they also tracked where they were looking. So if you're moving a station with a lot of people, of course this was done before Corona times, so people could be closer together. Well, you have to look around and you will decide where to go based on where you look. So very interesting, because you have this interplay between your attention, in which direction is your attention projected, and where you end up going. And here, another example in which you have a crowd. In this case, it's a simulated crowd. And you can imagine this is a very important area of research, because it's very useful for two huge industries, which are the cinema and games, computer games. So in this case, the point is this: if you want to simulate a crowd moving, well, you need to simulate each element of the crowd and then make them move naturally. And part of this is really essentially a Brownian dynamic simulation with appropriate parameters. Of course, then there is the computer graphic, which helps to make it look realistic. But I guess all of you played with some games where the graphics is wonderful, but the subjects seem to move in a way that doesn't look natural. And that means that you need to simulate it better. Okay, so this is just a very quick set of examples that might inspire you to think about where you can apply these agent-based models or active Brownian motion dynamics and so on. To try to understand how this works, let's see what are the key ingredients for an agent-based model. And here we can see that the key ingredients, what are they? Typically, I would ask in class, and typically people will tell me it's agents, and that's correct. You need to have agents. So what are agents? Well, agents is each unit in your system, and this unit can be, well, your system in which you're interested can go from a single unit, like the fish example looking for food, to a huge number of agents, almost infinite. Here, infinite obviously means as large as your computer memory your computer can manage. And well, what is an agent? An agent is a unit in your simulation, and this unit must be able to take decisions. That's the crucial part. So a passive Brownian particle is probably not going to be an agent in your system. Even an active Brownian particle, well, an active Brownian particles could be even better if this object can take decisions. So you can think of this, for example, humans in a crowd. or animals, even plants. You can say, yeah, but plants are not moving, therefore why should I consider it an agent? Well, plants don't move, but for example, plants can reproduce, and they can have a reproduction pattern. You can think about forests, how they grow, how they interact, how different species of plants interact with each other in order to colonize the forest. Some of you might, just to give you a simple example, often forest fires are considered bad for good reason, but one thing that people often don't think about is that some plants engineer fires to ensure their evolutionary success. Just to give you a very concrete example, savannas. The grass in savannas becomes flammable not because it's good for the single grass plant, but because it's good on an evolutionary scale to prevent other plants from growing. And savannas on an evolutionary scale are something that really came up very recently. So there were no savannas in the Cretaceous. Anyway, cars, very good agent because, but agents can be even more abstract, like organizations or media and so on. What are the properties of agents? First of all, they must be autonomous, as I was mentioning before. So an agent must be able to make decisions. Otherwise, it's not an agent, it's a passive obstacle. A wall should not be considered an agent in your simulation unless it can make decisions. They should be adaptive. What does it mean, adaptive? Well, they must be able to respond in different ways to different situations. So they have to have some sense, some capability of sensing their environment. And they can be, they don't have to be, but they can be heterogeneous. What does it mean? It means that you can have multiple agents belonging to different species within the same simulation or different categories. Okay, so what do we do typically with these agents? Well, typically we don't want the agents to live in a vacuum. We want the agents to be part of an environment, to interact with an environment. What is the environment? Well, we saw even in the previous hour some example. For example, the search strategy, we saw that they change dramatically when you move from a homogeneous environment to a Swiss cheese environment with holes where the agents can move from one hole to the next. But so the topography of the environment matters. Can be a landscape, there can be targets, there can be connections between different parts of the environment, resources that the agents are looking for example, food or mates, risks such as predators from which the agents are escaping, or areas that might be, I don't know, contaminated and therefore the agents should avoid. And well, there can be roads connecting different parts of the environment. So agents and environment, they must interact with each other. What else? Well, there must be behavioral rules. So you must put behavioral rules that tell the agents how to interact between themselves and with the environment. So what are these interaction rules? As I said, there can be interactions between agents, so one agent-to-agent interactions, and there can be agent-environment interactions. And of course, these rules can be either synchronized or non-synchronized in their update. What does it mean? Synchronized means that in each time step of your simulation, all agents get updated together. So you have a snapshot of your system, and all agents use this, the knowledge of this snapshot of your system to update their state. That's synchronized. Non-synchronized means that each agent updates itself at a different time. For example, you could go in a round robin across all the agents and update each one of them, and this means that they are not all synchronized. Another reason to not synchronize agents, it could be that your simulation is not in discrete time steps. You could have a continuous simulation, and that often is the case when you use very large simulation platforms, because you might have different computers simulating different agents, and they interact at random times, so you don't have a natural sequence of time steps, and then you might want to use non-synchronized updates. Now, that's very important because it might affect the dynamics of your system. In one model, which is known as the Vicek model, which is very important, we'll mention it later, and it's one of the readings that I gave you. For example, there's been in the last, well, this model was introduced in the 90s, but very recently, which means in the 2010s, people noticed that depending on how you do the update, you get different behaviors for the system. Not totally different, but different enough that people cared. Okay, and a small note on this. If you go to homework 1, many of you asked us about this. How should we update the agents or in homework 1? Should every agent be updated at the same time, or should we update one agent at a time? It doesn't matter in that case. You will get qualitatively very close result. In that case, it really doesn't matter. But in other cases, it might matter. And you should have this in your mind. And of course, it's also important to think about the history dependence of your system. What does it mean? It means, do your agents decide what to do based on a snapshot of the system at one time? Or do they use knowledge about the history of how the system has evolved in order to decide what to do? Again, very important when you decide to set up your simulation. So these are the key ingredients for an agent-based model. And you need to think about these elements very, very carefully. So what are the agents I want to use? How do they interact between each other? What is the environment? How do they interact with the environment? And what are the behavioral rules, and how am I going to use them? So this is the set of questions that you have to ask yourself. Let's go with a very concrete example, and this is schools of fish. Schools of fish are very important in this field because many people study them. In particular, most of the work, well, actually all of the work that I will present today is done in the lab of Cousin in, I think in Constance, well, for sure in Germany, I think in Constance, and it's very nice work and very visual too. So what do they study in this case? What they studied is fishes. So you have these fishes of these species, and they are put in a tank, which is 2 meters by 1 roughly, and it's very thin so that the fishes really are in a quasi two-dimensional environment. And then they have different numbers of fishes from 30 to 300, and they acquire very long videos, like 56 minute, 1 hour videos. And obviously all the videos I will show you are accelerated. I mean, you see, this is a very, well, this is a nice transition experiment, let's say, because this is not fishes in their natural environment, which might be too difficult for us to model in a first step. And it's not just a simulation because these are actual fishes, they're living beings that do what they want. So constructing such an experiment permits us to bridge reality, physical reality, which might be far too complex, and mathematical models that we want to use for simulating such physical reality. And so we can optimize the parameters on such simple system and then try to use these parameters in the real system, in the real world, and see how well they work. Anyway, so let's look at their experiments. These are experiments. So here you see 30 fishes, and you see how they move around. So notice that it's not totally random. I mean, it's definitely not random motion. These fishes are moving, swirling and moving from one place to another. They like to stay together, obviously. Once in a while, one fish goes away, but comes back pretty quickly. Let's now increase the number of fishes. With 70 fishes, you see that the dynamics are already different. Can you notice that? So you notice that now they create more, well, a swirl of milling fishes moving, and this swirl doesn't move that much around. If you go to 150 fishes, you see again it changes, because now they don't just create, let's say, a vortex of fishes, but probably there are too many fishes to create such a vortex, and once in a while it becomes a swarm which goes to a different place. Let's run this again. And finally, when we go to 300 fishes, we see that we have, again, very different dynamics. You see that now, again, there is, I mean, to me, it looks like that this one is too big and breaks down more easily than this one. So if I want fishes to create a vortex, I should go around 170 fishes, but definitely not 300 because it's just too big. I mean, this is purely qualitative. So these are experimental data. And these are experimental data you might get at some point, and then you want to build a model to understand how to reproduce this numerically. So we need to identify properties. Before we go into making a model, we need to understand the physical system we are studying. And this means we need to, well, start qualitatively understand it, and we see that we can already identify something almost by eye. And you have swarms of fishes. So these fishes obviously don't move independently from each other. They create swarms, so collection of fishes. And these groups of fishes can become polarized in the sense that they move all in the same direction together, swarming in a polarized fashion towards one direction. But they can also meal. So they can create this kind of vortices of fishes. So these are the behavior we observed. This is not quantitative, obviously. This is just observational. But if you want to do anything useful with models and in comparing models to actual experiments, we need to be more quantitative than this. So the question is, how can we quantify the motion of the fishes? And well, even before that, I mean, this is the paper from Vicek in which he essentially reproduced a swarming model. This slide should not be here, it should be later. So what I want to do next is to quantify the motion of the fishes. How do I do that? Well, the first thing we can do, well, we have to introduce what is called order parameters. And the first order parameters we can introduce is a polarization order parameters, which permits us to tell how much polarized is our swarm of fishes. And you see how we can make this. You see this formula? So here, what do we have? We have a sum. So UI, it's the direction, the unit vector representing the direction representing the direction of each fish, UI. Now, the absolute value here is wrong, as you might have noticed. The absolute value should be after the summation. So we sum vectorially the unit vectors of each fish, and after summing them vectorially, we take the absolute value, and then we divide by the number of fishes. Then you see what happens. If the fishes are all exactly in the same direction, when you sum the unit vector, you will get just n times the unit vector. So when you take the modulus, you get n divided by n, you get 1. So when we get this order parameter equal to 1, means that the fishes are all aligned. It's fully polarized. What happens in the opposite case, where the fishes are just moving randomly, in random directions? Well, then each unit vector will point in a different direction. When you sum them up, they will sum to essentially 0, more or less. And then when you take the modulus, you get 0, and 0 divided by n is 0, so the polarization order parameter will be 0. So this parameter goes from 0 to 1. 0 means that you have a swarm with random direction for all the fishes. 1 means that the fishes are all aligned in the same direction.
Could I interrupt with a question?
Yes.
You say you take the modulus, but I don't see a modulus in this formula you presented here.
This one?
Okay, that's the modulus.
But it's wrong. It should not be here. It should be after the summation.
Yeah, I was confused. Okay.
Yeah, but it's very important. But it's good that you point attention on the modulus. So we want to sum the vectors vectorially and then take the modulus of the total vector. Obviously, if you sum the moduli of unit vector, we just get n.
When you say modulo, do you mean like the length of the vector, basically?
Yes. The length of the vector of the absolute value depends on.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah. because you see this is a scalar parameter. Yeah, so you need to sum the vectors vectorially, the unit vectors vectorially, and then take the length of the resulting vector. And if this length is n times the unit vector of the single fish, then the unit vector then means that they are all in the same direction. If it's more or less 0, means that they are completely random. If you get something intermediate, means that you have partial polarization.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. And here again, well, then, okay, just a second. Then we want to, like this, we can measure the polarization, but we also want to measure the milling. So how much these are rotating around the place. And you see, you do essentially the same, but this time you do it for, well, essentially you measure the torque of the system the same way. And this will give you another parameter, which is the rotational order parameter, which again goes from 0, which means that there is no rotational component, to 1, which means that the system of fishes is rotating, is whirling. Okay? Is this clear? If anyone has urgent questions about this, please unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, what was the n, the vector n with some subscripts that you have there?
C, you mean this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. So UI, it's the unit vector of the direction of each fish, and CM stands for center of mass. So this is the this is the center of mass of the system in the unit vector of the center of mass of the system in the direction I. So you have obviously this for X, Y, and Z. And again, the modulus should be taken after the summation.
Okay, thank you.
Is this clear? Any more questions? These are very important because otherwise you cannot really follow what I say afterwards. So if there is any question, anything unclear, please ask now. Okay, so I proceed. Okay, now we measure it. So now you remember we had 30, 70, 150, and 300 fishes, and we can measure the order parameters. So here you see in blue, we have the polarization order parameter for each case as a function of time. And in red, we have the rotation or milling order parameter for each case. And we see that, well, if you remember the videos, what did we have for 30 fishes? You see, we have good polarization, but very bad rotation. This means that we have a swarm that moves around, but is not milling. But in the case of 70, you remember they were really milling very well. They were not very well polarized, but you can see this very clearly here because the rotation order parameter goes up. And this is actually true for all the other cases. This means that above a certain number of fishes, the fishes will stop just creating a swarm, they will start milling. But then one thing also that you can observe is that when you have more than 30 fishes, often the fishes switch between rotating on them, from milling to creating a polarized swarm. And you can see that you have switches between these two. And the nice thing here is that you can quantify these switches. You see that? Because you can measure how long they stay in the rotation state, how often they switch into the polarized swarming state. And you see that as the number of fishes increases, they stay longer in a rotation state. Can you see that? And also you can notice that, as we said while we were watching the video, well, the rotation state for 70 and 150 fish is pretty good because it's very close to 1. You see that? For 300 fishes, it's longer, but it's worse. Can you see that? So what I'm saying here is that by having this rotation, this order parameters, you can really quantify the observation, the qualitative observation we made on the fishes before. So this permits us to tell something very quantitative, very objective about the experiment. Why do we care? Well, we care because then we can use this information to verify if a model we make in simulation respects the properties of the system. So ideally, if we make a model, we would like to see similar order parameters. Now, how do we model the fish motion? Well, again, this is based on the work of Cousin, and essentially what you can do is the following. You have a fish. Think of it as, well, you can really think of it as almost an active Brownian particle without too much noise, very, very straight, and which can decide to change direction. And a very powerful way of representing how the fish decides what to do is to create zones around the fish. So here you can have, for example, a zone of repulsion. What does it mean in practice? It means that if the fish sees any fish in this zone of repulsion, will try to move away because it doesn't want to get too close to other fishes. Then you can have another zone, which is zone of orientation. What does it mean? It means that if the fish sees any other fish in the zone of orientation, it might want to reorient to go more or less in the same direction to produce swarming. And you can have, but without going closer to them, just reorienting. And you can have, for example, a zone of attraction, which means that if the fish sees any other fish in this zone of attraction, will not only reorient towards them, but also move towards them because it wants to get closer to them. I mean, I'm not saying that every model of fish should have exactly these zones. You can change the zone as you want. You can have different kind of zone which mean different things depending on what you want to model, but it's a very powerful tool in order to understand, to model how a system of, in this case, fishes behave together. One more thing that I would like you to notice is that the fish is obviously aligned in one direction, in this case in this direction, towards the x-axis. Well, the zone could be obviously just spheres around the fish in 3D or circles in 2D if you wish, but they can also be cones, or they don't need to be symmetric. They could be cones. For example, a fish could look only in one direction, and there can be repulsion only if there is another fish in front of it, not in the back. So you can play with that a lot. So you have a huge amount of parameters you can play with here, and yeah, you can then see what happens. So anyway, so let's go back to the video. So this is one of the videos, a bit slower. And if you want to model that, we can try different things. For example, we can have attraction plus repulsion. So this means that you have short-range attraction and long-range repulsion. And what you see is that obviously this is not a very good model because it doesn't look anything like that. And so you can go and try something more complex. So you might, for example, add attraction, repulsion plus alignment. So when the fishes come close, they not only, well, get attracted or repulsed, but they also get aligned. That might solve the problem if we wait long enough, but it doesn't seem powerful enough because obviously you don't get the same qualitative result. Then you could try to do something else. What else? You can also make the fish turn. And this qualitatively seems to capture a bit better what the fishes are doing. I'm not saying that these are good simulations. I'm just saying the way you think when you try to make such a comparison between experiments and a simulation model. So you have a certain ingredients in the model. You try to get it to be as similar as possible to the experiment you want to model. And finally, what you will have to do is to actually quantify it in terms of the order parameters that you think are relevant for your experiment. Okay, so just, yeah, so that's more or less the idea, and that's the approach you should follow when you want to study an experimental system and model it with a simulation. Here, to conclude this class, I just show you two more videos, again, from the Cousin lab, very nice. So again, it's fishes, and I just think that these are very nice videos that can inspire you. So let's run it. They can inspire you in how to model and analyze complex systems. So in this case, for example, the fish swarm is modeled as an ensemble of well, fishes, of units connected by essentially like a graph. We'll speak more about graphs in the next class. And this graph has fishes that are connected when they see each other, essentially. And this permits you then to use all the tools of graph theory in order to analyze this swarm of fishes. Another example here is to try to understand how the fishes make decisions on an individual level. So in this case, basically what they did is the following. For each fish, they study its cone of vision. So what the question that this analysis tries to answer is, what is a given fish seeing? And then obviously, how can the fish use the information it has access to, so what he actually sees, in order to take decisions? And of course, here you see the cone of view of a fish, and then you can create this zone model like this one, and you see that there are different zones and different hypotheses about what the fish should do when it sees fishes in the various zones, and how it should react. And you can make a model and verify if the model, well, you can study what happens in the different areas statistically, which gives you some inputs that then you can use in your simulation. And once you use them in your simulation, then you can verify if you get the same results or not. Often you will not get the same results, and then the question is why, and more importantly, whether the results you get are good enough for the purpose you have. Because typically you don't want a perfect model of your system, you want a minimal model that captures the aspects that you are really interested in. That's why it's so important to first analyze the system and decide what you want to learn about it with your simulations. Okay, so with this I conclude this class. And of course, if there are questions, again, please just mute yourself and ask them. And later I will look at the chat. So I see that there are lots of questions in the chat. So if you have any of these questions that you would like me to answer, please ask them now.
Is it okay to ask questions about the homeworks?
Sure.
Or do you want?
Any question. You can ask questions about the homeworks, about the course. Whatever you like.
Okay, I had a question about possibly scaling down the size of homework 1, because when you in the how do you call it, the PDF we got, I think the size of the arena was 100 by 100, and there were 1,000 agents. Can we expect the same behavior if we scale it down? Say that if we scale down the arena 20 by 20, is it possible to keep the same behavior if we keep the density the same?
Qualitatively it will be very similar, but of course if you go 20 by 20 and you have
that's 48.
Yeah, that might not be enough to. You need to maintain some statistical power in your simulation. If the model becomes too cross-grained, then you don't really capture the features. So I will guess 100 by 100, maybe 20 by 20. I will guess it will be too small.
And how is that judgment up to you, or is it up to us to judge the model accuracy, or if there is any statistical artifact?
That's why do I tell you that 20 by 20 is small? That's my judgment and my experience. I cannot really. The reason is that then 20 by 20, how many agents do you want to put there?
We've experimented with different values, and we still see the phase change in exercise 4 for reasonable parameter values.
It might be. I'm not saying that qualitatively will not be the same. It will be qualitatively the same. It's just that it might be a bit rough. So then, one of the things that you want to capture in this model is the overall trend in a population. So you don't want the results to depend excessively on the initial randomness or in the randomness of the motion. If you have 20 agents, there is a bit too much the randomness in their motion and initial configuration might be a bit large. That's what I'm saying. That's the reason.
But in the same, we were also encouraged to do an averaging in the last time. So if we have a smaller population,
Sure.
but average over,
you could do that. If yeah, you could do that. I don't think it will be qualitatively wrong what you get at the end.
May I add to this discussion?
Yeah. Yes.
So I tried it for both like 120 grid size in length, and I think it's actually, I would say it's more feasible to do the smaller grid size, because qualitatively you get the same result, but the calculation of the 100 by 100 makes the last problem a bit too slow. If you want to have, say, 30 times 30 points in the beta k plane and want to average for 10 runs, that's much more feasible to do for a 20 by 20 grid.
I don't have anything against 20 by 20 if it works.
Yeah.
So, and I completely agree. Anyway, one important point, which is actually more general than the homework, I think it's very useful in general to start with very small simulations. Even if you then want to scale it up, you should not start with a full system. You should start with something small, which permits you to get some insight into the problem without too much computational cost. That's a general rule of thumb that you should follow always. But to study the scaling behavior, for sure, you can go towards smaller models as well. The only thing, be aware of the averaging. You need to do more averaging if you go to smaller models because of this stronger dependence on randomness, initial randomness. Okay. Any other questions?